My name is Alvadonna. I'm 36 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been introduced as someone's wife before I was ever introduced as myself. On paper, I was easy to define: supportive, practical, organized, the steady one, the kind of woman people assume will always make it work. I handled logistics, I remembered birthdays, I built quiet systems in the background so life could move smoothly for everyone else. And because I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't demand applause, because I didn't constantly talk about my dreams out loud, people assumed I didn't have any, including my husband. When he told me our marriage was over because I didn't support his dreams, he said it calmly, almost kindly, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. He said he needed someone more passionate, someone more aligned with his ambition, someone who believed in him the way he believed in himself. Then he left to follow what he called his passion. What he didn't realize was that I had been quietly securing our future for years. And when he walked away from something he had never truly understood. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or public humiliation. There was no screaming match, no broken plates, no explosive courtroom scene. It's about perception. It's about silence. It's about what happens when the person everyone underestimates is the only one who was actually paying attention. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you who I was in that marriage, how small dismissals slowly rewrote the script of our life, and how I made one decision that changed everything without raising my voice once. I won't paint myself as a saint. I won't paint him as a monster. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways. That's what made it harder to see. This is a story about emotional gravity, about what happens when someone mistakes steadiness for weakness, about how quiet preparation can outlast loud ambition. And maybe, somewhere in this story, you'll recognize a moment from your own life, a time when you were called too practical, too calm, or not supportive enough, simply because you didn't perform your devotion loudly. If you've ever been misunderstood because you didn't advertise your strength, I think you'll understand what happened next. Before we go any further, let me introduce you properly to the woman I was, back then the version of me they thought they knew. If you had asked my husband to describe me during the last year of our marriage, he would have smiled politely and said something safe. Alva, she's solid. She keeps everything together. I don't know what I'd do without her. It sounded like praise, but what he meant was she will absorb the weight. To his friends, I was the organized one. The woman who remembered dinner reservations, who gently reminded them of deadlines, who brought the right documents to the right meetings. When we hosted gatherings in our Seattle apartment, I was the quiet efficiency in the kitchen, refilling glasses before anyone asked, smoothing over awkward silences with a change of subject. People mistook anticipation for passivity. At work, I was an operations manager, the invisible architecture behind other people's success. If a project launched smoothly, it was because I had triple-checked every contingency. If a crisis never happened, it was because I saw it coming months in advance. But no one applauds what doesn't break. And at home, that pattern followed me. My husband was creative, vision-driven, restless. He liked to talk about the future in sweeping language startups, passion projects, reinvention. He liked the feeling of being the protagonist of his own evolving story. I liked building foundations. In the early years, I thought we complemented each other. He dreamed, I planned, he leapt, I calculated the landing. But somewhere along the way, the narrative shifted. Instead of being complementary, I became background. When he described our dynamic to others, it was always framed the same way. I'm the risk taker, she's the practical one, said with a laugh, said like it was charming. And maybe it was at first. But slowly, I began to notice the translation underneath it. Risk-taker meant brave. Practical meant cautious. Brave sounded admirable. Cautious sounded limiting. He never said I was small. He never said I lacked ambition. He simply spoke about himself as if he were expanding, and about me as if I were stabilizing. Stability is useful, but it is rarely celebrated. I didn't object. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't feel threatened. I knew who I was. I knew the value of compound growth, of emergency funds, of diversified investments. I knew how many nights I had stayed up researching financial models while he slept peacefully after announcing another big pivot. I understood our life at a structural level that he never bothered to examine. But outwardly, I let him narrate to us. At family gatherings, his mother would squeeze my hand and say, "You're so good for him. You keep him grounded." Grounded, as if he were a balloon, and I with a string tied to his ankle. No one ever asked what kept me grounded. No one asked what I wanted next. I didn't correct them. I didn't argue for airtime. I wasn't interested in competing for the spotlight. I believed that substance didn't need performance. What I didn't realize was that silence can slowly erase dimension. Over time, people stopped asking about my work in detail. They assumed it was stable, predictable, which, in their minds, meant uninteresting. Meanwhile, every half-formed idea my husband shared was treated like a coming revolution, even when those ideas dissolved months later. There is a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't feel violent. It feels polite. It feels like being gently edged out of the frame. I wasn't unhappy then. Not exactly. But I was shrinking in other people's perception, even as my internal world expanded. And the most dangerous part, I believed that being underestimated was harmless. I thought, let them think I'm simple. Let them think I'm steady. Let them think I exist to support. I didn't understand yet that perception shapes permission. And once someone sees you as the infrastructure instead of the architect, they stop asking what you're building. That was who I was to them. Reliable, predictable, supportive. A foundation, not a force. At least, that's what they thought. The first cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like dinner. We were sitting at a long wooden table with two other couples friends from my husband's college days. It was one of those trendy Seattle restaurants where the lighting is intentionally dim and the conversation is intentionally loud. Everyone was mid-career, mid-ambition, mid-reinvention. The topic turned, as it often did, to what's next. My husband had recently become obsessed with the idea of leaving his stable marketing job to launch a creative media studio. He had mock-ups, a logo concept, a name that changed every week. He spoke about it as if it were inevitable. That night, he was especially animated. "I just can't stay somewhere that doesn't align with my passion," he said, leaning forward. "I'd rather fail chasing something big than succeed doing something safe." Everyone nodded. There's something intoxicating about that kind of sentence. It sounds cinematic, heroic. One of the wives turned to me. "That's exciting. You must be so supportive." I smiled. "I think it's important to think through the financial runway first. We'd need at least 18 months of expenses covered before making that leap, and health insurance adjustments, and..." He interrupted me. Not aggressively, not sharply, just lightly. "Alva always thinks in spreadsheets." He laughed. "That's why I don't tell her everything at first. She'll kill the vibe." The table laughed. It was harmless on the surface, playful, familiar. But something inside me registered the sentence like a quiet alarm. "I'll kill the vibe." As if caution were sabotage, as if foresight were negativity. I felt the shift in the room, the way they repositioned me in their minds. Not as a partner in the dream, but as the resistance to it. I could have clarified. I could have said, "I'm not against it. I just believe in preparing properly." Instead, I took a sip of water. Because explaining yourself after someone has framed you a certain way can make you look defensive. And I didn't want to look defensive. The conversation moved on. More wine was poured. Someone made a joke about quitting corporate life. My husband glowed under the attention. But I replayed the sentence in my mind all the way home. That's why I don't tell her everything at first. It was meant to be funny. But it meant he was already editing me out of parts of his future. Later that night, while he brushed his teeth, I asked gently, "Do you really feel like I kill the vibe?" He shrugged. "No, babe. You're just cautious. I need space to dream before we get into logistics." Logistics was my domain. It was also the reason we had no debt, the reason we had savings, the reason his previous pivot hadn't devastated us. I nodded. Okay. I didn't argue. I didn't demand reassurance. But something subtle shifted in me. It wasn't anger. It was data collection. I began noticing how often he positioned himself as visionary and me as a limiter. How often he told stories where he was the bold one and I was the stabilizer. And how comfortable everyone seemed with that dynamic. It wasn't the interruption at dinner that hurt. It was the narrative he built in front of witnesses. Because once a story is told enough times publicly, it becomes identity. That was the first small cut. Not dramatic, not cruel, just a sentence wrapped in laughter. But I remembered it. And unlike the rest of them, I didn't forget. After that dinner, nothing exploded. There was no fight, no Cold War, no dramatic shift in tone. That's what makes subtle disrespect so dangerous it blends into routine. The interruptions continued, but they were softer than confrontation. If I raised a logistical concern about timing, he would smile and say, "Let's not overcomplicate it." If I asked about projected revenue, he'd respond, "You always jump to worst-case scenarios." I didn't. I ran probability models in my head the way other people ran affirmations. But the more he framed caution as negativity, the more I felt pressured to soften my delivery. I began adjusting my language. Instead of saying, "We can't afford that yet," I would say, "Maybe we should wait a bit." Instead of, "That projection isn't realistic," I would say, "What if we stress test that idea?" I made myself gentler, smaller, easier to agree with, because I told myself this is marriage, compromise is healthy. And to be fair, he wasn't reckless in obvious ways. He still paid his half of the bills, he still showed up for anniversaries, he wasn't cruel, he wasn't unfaithful, he wasn't volatile. He was simply evolving in a direction that didn't include my input as an equal. And I normalized it. When he began attending networking events without inviting me, I told myself it made sense they were creative industry circles, not operations focused. When he stayed out late brainstorming with collaborators, I convinced myself it was temporary, part of building something bigger. He spoke about the future constantly. "I just need someone who really believes in this," he said once, pacing the living room with his laptop open, like, "fully believes." I looked up from my planner. "I do believe in you," he sighed. Not dramatically, just faintly disappointed. "I know you do. You just believe in safety first." As if belief and safety were opposites. I absorbed that sentence too. Over time, I noticed how my silence started to protect him from accountability. If a concept fizzled out, I didn't say, "I warned you." If a contact ghosted him, I didn't say, "That's why contracts matter." I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the "I told you so" wife. But quiet can slowly become permission. The more I absorbed, the more confident he became in the story that he was the courageous one in a partnership constrained by practicality. And here's the part I rarely admit. There were moments I almost believed him. When someone hears a narrative about themselves often enough, it starts to sound like the truth. Maybe I was too rigid. Maybe I did lack vision. Maybe my need for structure made me incapable of understanding passion. I would lie awake at night replaying conversations, analyzing my tone, wondering if I had been too cold. That was the erosion not of love, but of position. I began second-guessing instincts that had served me for years. Yet something deeper in me remained steady. Because while he talked about risk, I quietly tracked our savings rate. While he imagined future revenue, I monitored investment growth. While he described me as cautious, I was making strategic decisions that allowed him to experiment at all. He didn't see that part. Or maybe he didn't want to. Disrespect rarely arrives as an insult. It arrives as a pattern, a framing, a subtle reshaping of roles. And I let that pattern continue because I believed loyalty meant endurance. I thought if I stayed steady enough, he would eventually see the architecture behind his freedom. I didn't realize yet that he had already stopped looking. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've been cast in a role you didn't audition for. For me, it wasn't loud. It was gradual. A slow crystallization of something that had been forming for years. I was the stabilizer, the safety net, the responsible one, not by accident but by assignment. I started noticing how introductions shaped expectations. At a networking mixer he insisted I attend. He introduced me to a group of designers and entrepreneurs as, "This is Alva. She's the reason I can even think about taking risks." Everyone smiled at me with polite appreciation. What they heard was, "She handles the boring stuff." No one asked what I built. No one asked what I managed at work. No one asked how many employees relied on my decisions daily. I wasn't framed as capable. I was framed as supportive. It sounds subtle, but language builds hierarchy. Support exists behind the main act. Even in our private conversations, the dynamic had hardened. When he mapped out his 5-year vision, I was positioned as infrastructure. "We'll probably need to tighten spending while I scale," he'd say. "But you're stable. You'll hold it down." Hold it down! Like I was the ground while he aimed for the sky. One evening, while reviewing our finances at the dining table, I realized something that startled me. Nearly 80% of our consistent income over the past 3 years has come from me. Not because he was irresponsible, but because his career was in constant transition. Contract roles, consulting gigs, half-built ventures, each one fueled by passion, each one unstable. And each time he shifted, I recalibrated quietly. I increased automatic investments when his income spiked. I built larger cash reserves before he made another leap. I refinanced at the right time. I negotiated insurance terms. I diversified. He experienced freedom because I engineered it. But the story he told to others and slowly to himself was that he was brave despite my caution. That night, I sat with my navy leather planner open in front of me. I traced my finger over numbers that represented years of discipline. And I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If I stopped holding it down, what would happen? Not in a threatening way, not as leverage, just as a reality check. The answer was simple. The dream would become fragile very quickly. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me aware. I had mistaken invisibility for humility. I had assumed that because I didn't need credit, it didn't matter who received it. But there's a difference between not seeking recognition and allowing misrepresentation. And I had allowed it. The role I was assigned wasn't villainous. It wasn't degrading in obvious ways. It was a dependable wife, practical partner, financial cushion. Useful, always useful. And usefulness is dangerous when it becomes the primary reason someone values you. Because usefulness can be replaced. Identity cannot. For the first time, I wondered whether he loved me or loved the stability I provided. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I simply began observing more carefully. Because once you see the role you've been placed in, you can't unsee it. And I was starting to understand that the script of our marriage had been written long before I realized I was reading from it. The shift didn't happen the day he left. It happened months before on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at my office, sitting in a glass conference room overlooking the grey Seattle skyline. Rain slid down the windows in thin, disciplined lines. I had just finished presenting a quarterly operational strategy to senior leadership, a restructuring plan that would reduce overhead by 12% without layoffs. They asked sharp questions. I answered without notes. When the meeting ended, my director paused at the door and said, "Alva, you don't just manage systems, you design them. Don't forget that." It was a simple comment, professional, unemotional, but it landed in a place inside me that had been quiet for years. "You design them." That evening, I came home to find my husband pacing the living room, phone in hand, energy buzzing. "I've decided," he said before I even set down my bag. "I'm going to do it. I'm giving notice next month. I can't keep living half alive." I listened. He spoke for 20 minutes straight about vision, timing, momentum, how the market was shifting, how this was his window. He never once asked what I thought. He finished with, "You get it, right, you'll support me." There it was again. Support. I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to erase me. He simply believed the story he'd been telling for years, that he was the driver of destiny and I was the stabilizer in the passenger seat. And in that moment, something inside me went still. Not resentful, not reactive, just clear. I realized I had been negotiating for inclusion in a narrative that was never written to include me as an equal. I could argue, I could demand acknowledgement, I could list every financial buffer I had built, every risk I had mitigated, every silent correction I had made. Or I could stop asking to be seen. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my planner at the kitchen table. Instead of recalculating how to protect us from his next leap, I ran projections assuming only one consistent income mine. I adjusted timelines, rerouted investments, modeled scenarios where his ventures failed entirely and scenarios where they succeeded without me. For the first time, I built a version of the future that did not require him. Not as punishment, as clarity. And the numbers didn't scare me. They steadied me. That was the shift. I stopped thinking in terms of our shared dream and started thinking in terms of structural independence. I didn't withdraw affection, I didn't change my tone, but internally, I moved from partnership preservation to personal positioning. Silence stopped being endurance. It became an assessment. Over the following weeks, I listened differently. When he spoke about needing someone more aligned with his ambition, I no longer tried to prove I was that person. When he implied I was too grounded to understand risk, I didn't correct him. I simply watched the gap widen. Because once you stop fighting for a role, you begin evaluating whether you want it at all. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. A woman at a kitchen table, realizing she had more leverage than she'd ever acknowledged, and choosing, for the first time, not to use it to protect someone who no longer valued it. After that night at the kitchen table, I didn't become colder. I became quieter in a different way. Before, my silence had been reactive, a way to avoid tension, to smooth edges, to preserve harmony. Now, it was intentional, measured, observational. He mistook it for agreement. When he announced he had officially submitted his resignation, I nodded. Okay. When he talked about scaling back our shared savings to free up liquidity for his studio launch, I said, let's review the numbers this weekend. No, not yet, just a calm postponement. He interpreted my composure as continued support. But internally, I had stopped merging our futures without scrutiny. I separated accounts in subtle ways, first not in secrecy, but in structure. I redirected new investment contributions into vehicles under my name only. I increased my retirement allocation quietly. I ensured all major assets were properly documented and transparently valued. Nothing illegal, nothing deceptive, just clarity. At dinner parties, when he framed his leap as finally breaking free from corporate constraints, I no longer softened the narrative. I didn't add context. I didn't explain that we had safety nets in place. I let him own the full weight of the story he was telling. Silence can be protection, but it can also be exposure. Without my careful reframing, his ambition sounded more absolute, less calculated. People admired it, but I noticed the flickers of concern too. Meanwhile, at home, the rhythm changed. He was energized, restless, consumed by branding, networking, and late-night brainstorming sessions. I respected that. Passion has its own gravity. But I stopped orbiting it. I no longer stayed up to help refine pitch decks unless he specifically asked. And even then, I asked structured questions instead of polishing language for him. I stopped preemptively solving problems he hadn't yet recognized. If a subscription lapsed, I didn't immediately fix it. If a vendor required documentation, I forwarded the email instead of handling it. He began experiencing friction. Not crisis, just friction. And for the first time, he had to manage it himself. One evening, he looked up from his laptop, frustration visible. Why does everything feel harder lately? He asked. I met his eyes. Because you're building something from scratch. He nodded slowly, as if that explanation satisfied him. It did. He didn't realize that for years. I had absorbed that friction before it ever reached him. My silence wasn't punishment. It was a recalibration. There's a misconception that power is loud, that dominance requires confrontation, but sometimes power is simply the removal of invisible labor. When you stop cushioning someone from consequence, reality becomes clearer for both of you. I wasn't trying to make him fail. I was allowing him to stand alone in the narrative he insisted on leading. And something else happened during that time. The more I withdrew from constant stabilization, the more I felt myself expand internally. I had time again, mental space, energy that wasn't allocated to managing someone else's volatility. I began revisiting professional opportunities I had declined in the past because they required travel or additional commitment. I updated certifications quietly, took advanced financial planning seminars online at night. He didn't notice. He was too focused on becoming, and that's when I understood something profound. He saw my silence as weakness because he had only ever experienced it as accommodation. He had never experienced it as a strategy. Now he was. He just didn't know it yet. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like a woman sitting at a kitchen table with a laptop open. It looks like someone is staying late at work just to finish a few things. It looks like an order. But beneath that order, I was building insulation. After he left his job, his days became fluid coffee meetings, co-working spaces, brand development calls. My days became sharper. I accepted a cross-departmental project at work that increased my visibility with executive leadership. I negotiated a performance-based compensation structure instead of a fixed raise. He didn't ask about the details. He would say, "Work going okay?" And I would answer, "Yes, busy." What he didn't notice was that busy now meant leverage. I began documenting everything not in suspicion, but in clarity. Shared expenses, asset allocations, contribution ratios, not to weaponize them, but to understand the full picture without illusion. Illusion is expensive. I reviewed our home title structure, confirmed beneficiary designations, updated my personal will, ensured my emergency fund was fully autonomous. Every step was legal, transparent, ethical, but independent. Meanwhile, his studio launched with enthusiasm and unpredictability. The first month was promising, the second, uneven, the third, slower. I didn't panic. I watched. When he grew discouraged, I offered encouragement, not financial rescue. When he floated the idea of pulling more from savings, I asked for projections, written ones. He resisted structure. Structure demands accountability. There was a night when he said, almost offhandedly, "You don't seem as invested as I thought you'd be." I held his gaze. "I'm invested in our stability." He frowned slightly. "That's what I mean. It feels like you're emotionally detached from this." And there it was. To him, emotional alignment meant enthusiasm for risk. To me, it meant responsibility for the outcome. We were no longer speaking the same language. What they never noticed, his friends, his family, even him, was that my loyalty had never been blind. It had been conditional on mutual respect. And once respect erodes, loyalty evolves. I started meeting with a financial advisor privately, not because I lacked knowledge, but because a third-party perspective sharpens decision-making. I explored property investment opportunities under my sole qualification profile. I evaluated long-term relocation possibilities based on career growth, not his network proximity. I wasn't planning to leave. I was planning to be unafraid if I needed to. That distinction matters. There's a calm that comes from knowing you can survive alone. Not because you want to, but because you've done the math. And the math was steady. One afternoon, while he was out pitching a potential client, I stood in our living room and looked around the apartment we had built together. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. If he succeeded, I would not diminish myself to fit beside him. If he failed, I would not collapse with him. For years, I had engineered shared safety. Now I was engineering optionality. Optionality is quite powerful. And the most ironic part, he thought I was disengaging because I didn't believe in him. In reality, I was disengaging because I had finally begun believing fully in myself. That was what they never noticed. Not the spreadsheets, not the strategic positioning, not the expansion of my own identity beyond supportive wife. They saw a woman who seemed less enthusiastic. They didn't see the architect reinforcing her own foundation. The reveal wasn't something I announced. It was something I discovered, alone. It happened on a Sunday morning, early, before he woke up. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic below. I had my laptop open, financial dashboards layered across the screen, personal accounts, investment portfolios, projections extending 10 years forward. I wasn't looking for escape. I was looking for the truth. For months, I had been modeling scenarios quietly. What if his studio stabilized at modest revenue? What if it scaled dramatically? What if it collapsed entirely? What if he left? What if I left? Most of the outcomes were survivable. But that morning, for the first time, I ran a clean projection based solely on my income, my assets, my contributions excluding his future potential entirely. The numbers didn't just hold. They strengthened. Between my retirement accounts, brokerage investments, emergency reserves, and the equity portion of our home attributable to my documented contributions, I had already built a structural cushion large enough to support a life that was not dependent on anyone else's volatility. I sat back in my chair. No adrenaline, no triumph, just stillness. For years, I had believed I was protecting us. But the data told a more nuanced story. I had been protecting myself, too, without fully acknowledging it. That was the private reveal. Not that he needed me, but I no longer needed him to feel secure. Security had never come from his ambition. It had come from my architecture. I thought about the dinner months earlier, She'll Kill the Vibe. I thought about the introductions, the framing, the subtle repositioning of me as a cautious anchor to his soaring narrative. He believed he was outgrowing me. What he didn't realize was that I had already outgrown the role he assigned me. There is a profound difference between wanting someone and requiring them. For most of our marriage, I wanted him. I loved his energy, his imagination, his ability to see possibilities where others saw constraints. But I had slowly mistaken desire for dependency. And that morning, the illusion dissolved. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The sky over Seattle was pale grey, the kind of neutral light that makes everything feel honest. If he left, I would not collapse. If he stayed, I would not shrink. That clarity changed my posture in ways he immediately felt, though he couldn't name it. Later that week, during an argument about budget allocations, he said, frustrated, "It feels like you don't need me anymore." The sentence hung in the air. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was delicate. Needing someone is not the same as loving them. But when someone measures their worth by being needed, independence feels like rejection. "I've never needed you to survive," I said gently. "I chose you." He looked unsettled. Choice is more powerful than dependency, but it's less controllable. The private reveal wasn't leverage to use against him. It was clarity about myself. And clarity is irreversible. Once you see that your foundation stands on its own, you stop negotiating from fear. You start negotiating from dignity. He thought my quiet distance meant I was losing faith in him. In reality, I had gained faith in myself, and that changes everything. There's a difference between realizing you can leave and deciding whether you will. Clarity gives you options. Options demand choice. By the time he said the sentence, "I don't think you really support my dreams," I wasn't shocked. We were sitting across from each other at the dining table. The same table where I had once recalculated our shared future. The same table where I had quietly built one of my own. His studio had hit another slow quarter. Cash flow was inconsistent. He had begun comparing us subtly at first to couples in his network where both partners were fully immersed in creative ventures. "They get it," he said. "Their wives are in it with them. All in." I folded my hands. "What does all in look like to you?" He exhaled sharply. Believing without constantly questioning. Being excited instead of cautious. Not making everything about contingency plans. There it was again. Excitement versus caution. Passion versus preparation. In his mind, I had become the emotional ceiling to his ambition. "I don't think we want the same kind of life," he said finally. The sentence was calm, measured, and honest. For a long time, I had believed that love meant adaptation, that if I could just communicate better, soften more, frame my concerns differently, we would realign. But sitting there, listening to him describe a partner who wasn't me, I understood something with startling simplicity. He didn't want support. He wanted reflection. He wanted someone who mirrored his appetite for risk, not someone who counterbalanced it. And I no longer wanted to contort myself into that mirror. That was the decision point. I had three options. First, fight for the marriage, argue that stability is love, demand recognition for the years I had carried structural weight. Second, compromise further, loosen my standards, inject artificial enthusiasm, perform belief loudly enough to soothe his doubt. Third, accept the divergence. Not dramatically, not bitterly, just accept it. The irreversible choice wasn't divorce paperwork. It was an internal release. As he spoke about feeling alone in his vision, I felt something unexpected peace. Because for months, I had been preparing for the possibility that this was where we were headed. Not because I wanted it, but because I refused to be blindsided by it. "I won't stand in the way of what you believe you need," I said quietly. He blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means if you feel this marriage limits you, you're free to choose differently." He stared at me, as if waiting for a protest, for tears, for negotiation. There were none. The calm unsettled him more than anger would have. "You're just okay with this?" he asked. No, I wasn't okay, but I was prepared. And preparation changes how pain lands. "I'm not okay with losing respect," I replied. "And I won't compete with your idea of a partner." Silence filled the room. That was the moment the path split. He could have stepped back, reconsidered, reframed his expectations. Instead, he said the sentence that finalized everything. "Maybe we rushed into this marriage before we really knew who we were." It wasn't cruel. It was convenient. And I understood. He wanted reinvention without anchors. I wanted evolution with integrity. Those are not the same thing. The decision point wasn't loud. It was a woman choosing dignity over persuasion. And once that choice is made, there's no returning to who you were before you made it. Once the decision was made internally, the rest became procedural. There were no slammed doors, no accusations thrown across the room, no dramatic ultimatums. He didn't leave that night. In fact, we continued living in the same space for several weeks, polite, measured, strangely civil. But beneath that civility, I was moving, in silence. The first thing I did was schedule a consultation with a family law attorney. Not because I wanted to escalate, but because clarity requires expertise. I brought documentation, neatly organized account statements, property records, tax filings, and contribution histories. The attorney reviewed everything carefully. "You've kept excellent records," she said. I nodded. I always had. There was no manipulation involved, no hidden accounts, no secret transfers, just documentation of reality. Because the truth, when properly recorded, is powerful enough on its own. Next, I initiated a formal financial separation discussion, calmly, structured, transparent. "If we're going to move toward dissolution," I said one evening, "we need to define interim financial boundaries." He looked startled by the word dissolution, as if I had introduced a concept he hadn't fully anticipated would materialize so concretely. "I didn't think you'd move this fast," he admitted. I met his eyes. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." That was the part he never understood. For him, this was a recent emotional realization. For me, it was the conclusion of months of quiet assessment. I separated direct deposit allocations, closed joint credit lines where appropriate, ensured shared subscriptions and liabilities were properly itemized. Nothing aggressive, just clean lines. He continued working on his studio, telling people he was in a transitional phase. He spoke about personal growth, about alignment, about needing space to become who he was meant to be. And I let him. I didn't correct the narrative publicly. I didn't expose financial realities or clarify timelines. Silence, again, became exposure. At work, I accepted a promotion opportunity that required occasional travel. I signed the revised contract without hesitation. Increased compensation, performance bonus structure, executive mentorship access. He found out when I updated my calendar. "You didn't tell me you were negotiating that," he said. I didn't think it required discussion. I replied evenly. We were no longer making joint futures. We were unwinding one. The house became quieter. Not hostile, just emotionally distant. Two adults moving through logistics with professionalism. There's a misconception that power reveals itself in confrontation. But true power often reveals itself in administration. In paperwork, in signatures, in dates. He expected resistance, drama, a pleading phase. Instead, he encountered efficiency. And efficiency unsettles people who assume you're emotionally dependent. One night, while packing a few of his belongings to move temporarily into a rented studio space, he paused and said, "You're handling this like it's just business." I considered that. "It's not business," I said softly. "It's reality." The truth was, I had already grieved the marriage before the paperwork began. I had mourned the role, the perception, the gradual erosion of mutual vision. What remained was structure. And I am very good at structure. He thought leaving to follow his passion would be the boldest move in this story. He didn't realize the boldest move had already happened quietly, at a kitchen table, months earlier. And now, everything else was simply execution. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They unfold gradually like interest accruing. At first, everything looked almost optimistic. He moved into a short-term rental closer to the creative district. He posted photos of brainstorming sessions, late nights, coffee shops with exposed brick and ambitious captions about building something real. From the outside, it looked like reinvention. From the inside, I could see the strain. Not because he told me, but because patterns leave traces. The first consequence was financial. Without my income cushioning variability, his studio's inconsistent cash flow stopped being exciting and started being stressful. Expenses that once felt manageable now required negotiation. Vendor invoices demanded prioritization. Health insurance premiums became real numbers instead of abstract line items I used to quietly absorb. He called one evening about a shared bill that hadn't yet been fully separated. I didn't realize how much all of this actually costs, he admitted, voice tight. I didn't say, I know. I said, it adds up. The second consequence was social. The same friends who once admired his leap began asking practical questions. How's revenue looking? Have you locked in long-term clients? What's the runway? Questions I used to ask, framed now without laughter. Passion sounds magnetic in the beginning, but sustainability earns respect. He stopped attending as many group dinners. When he did, the energy was different, less triumphant, more defensive. Meanwhile, my life grew steadier, not louder, steadier. The promotion at work expanded my influence. I was brought into strategy discussions that shaped the company's direction. My name appeared on internal leadership memos. I traveled occasionally, nothing glamorous, just purposeful. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce it. But people noticed. One mutual friend said to me quietly at a gathering, "You seem centered." Centered? Not bitter, not broken. Centered. That was the third consequence. He had expected me to unravel, to realize what I'd lost. Instead, I expanded. Without the constant emotional recalibration required to manage someone else's volatility, my energy was redistributed inward. I slept better, I read more, I revisited interests I'd set aside. When we met to finalize asset division details, he looked at me carefully. "You're different," he said. "I've always been this way," I replied. "You just don't see me through the same lens anymore." He hesitated. "I thought you'd fight harder," he confessed. There it was again, the expectation of emotional chaos. I fought quietly for a long time. I said, "You just didn't recognize the language." The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposed. Exposure to the true cost of independence without infrastructure. Exposure to the reality of risk without silent stabilization. He began to realize that what he had framed as a limitation had actually been scaffolding. And scaffolding is only appreciated when it's gone. One afternoon, he asked if we could revisit the timeline. "Maybe we rushed into ending this," he said. "Maybe we just needed space." But space was what he had asked for. And I had given it fully. What he hadn't anticipated was that I would use that space to solidify myself instead of waiting for him to return. The consequences weren't dramatic. No financial ruin, no public failure, just friction. Responsibility without buffer, ambition without anchor. And slowly, the recognition that the life he thought was restrictive had actually been remarkably secure. By then, the structure had already shifted, and structures, once reconfigured, don't easily revert. Regret rarely arrives as a dramatic confession. It seeps in through small cracks. By the time he asked to talk seriously, I could already see the shift in him, not defeat but recalibration. The studio hadn't collapsed, but it hadn't soared either. It existed in a constant state of hustle. Invoices chased, promises stretched, energy spent proving momentum instead of building it. We met at a quiet cafe near the waterfront, neutral ground. He looked older, not physically but structurally, as if reality had added weight to his posture. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe I misjudged what support actually looks like." I didn't interrupt. He continued. "Slower now. I thought I needed someone who believed without hesitation. But I'm starting to realize hesitation isn't the same as doubt. No, it's discernment. I didn't appreciate what you were holding," he admitted. "I thought you were holding me back." There it was. The sentence I had waited months to hear, not because I needed validation, but because I needed clarity about whether he understood. And now I asked gently, "Now I see that you were building things I didn't even know needed building." His voice wasn't manipulative. It wasn't desperate. It was honest. But honesty after consequence carries a different weight. "I don't know if we should have ended it," he said finally. "Maybe we just needed to adjust." Adjust. The word felt too small for what had happened. I thought about the months of internal recalibration, the nights at the kitchen table, the legal consultations. The emotional release had already taken place long before the paperwork formalized anything. I had grieved the version of us that might have worked if respect had been mutual. "I didn't end this because you followed your passion," I said calmly. "I ended this because you framed my stability as a limitation." He looked down. I was wrong. Yes, but being wrong doesn't reverse the process. Do you want to try again? He asked quietly. That question would have shattered me a year earlier. Now it felt like a test of alignment. Trying again would mean re-entering a dynamic that required him to fundamentally redefine how he sees partnership. It would mean trusting that his newfound appreciation wouldn't erode the next time ambition surged. It would mean shrinking my expansion back into shared negotiation. I took a breath. I don't want to rebuild something that only works when you're struggling, I said softly. I want to build something that works when we're both strong. He absorbed that. Silence stretched between us, not hostile, not dramatic, just final. Regret doesn't erase trajectory. By the time he understood my value, I no longer needed him to. That's the part people misunderstand about timing. Apologies matter. Growth matters. But they don't always arrive early enough to preserve structure. I never thought you'd actually let me go, he said. I held his gaze. I never thought you'd actually underestimate me. Too late doesn't mean cruel. It means the process is completed. And once something has fully completed inside you, it cannot be restarted by nostalgia. We finished our coffee, stood, walked in separate directions along the water. No shouting, no tears in public. Just two people acknowledging that understanding had arrived after the bridge had already been dismantled. And some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in our old living room, mostly empty now. The furniture had been divided. The artwork was taken down. Even the echo in the space felt different, as if the walls understood something had concluded. We were there to sign the last of the documents: formal dissolution, asset transfers, clean closure. No audience, no theatrics, just two signatures and a history. He stood near the window for a long moment before sitting down across from me at the dining table, the same table where so many subtle shifts had first taken place. I keep replaying things, he said quietly, trying to figure out where I started seeing you as opposition. I appreciated the phrasing. Not an enemy, not an obstacle. Opposition. Probably around the time you decided excitement mattered more than endurance, I replied calmly. There was no edge in my voice, just accuracy. He nodded slowly. I thought you didn't believe in me. I believed in you. I said, I just didn't believe in unmanaged risk. He almost smiled at that, a familiar recognition of how differently we process the world. For the first time in months, we weren't defending positions. We were acknowledging frameworks. You made me feel small sometimes, he admitted, like my ideas weren't big enough. I considered that. I asked for structure. I said, not smaller dreams. Silence settled between us again, but it wasn't heavy. It was clarifying. I see now that you were building the ground I was standing on, he said, and I kept acting like I was flying. That's because you liked the story better that way, I answered gently. He didn't argue. There was no point. The confrontation, if you could call it that, wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. Recognition that neither of us was a villain. Recognition that misalignment can coexist with love. Recognition that underestimating someone doesn't make them weak, it just blinds you to their architecture. He slid the final document toward me. This is really it, he said. Yes, I replied. He hesitated. Are you angry? I searched myself honestly. No, I said, I'm clear. Clarity is often mistaken for coldness by people who expect chaos. He signed first. I signed second. The sound of pen on paper was louder than it should have been. When it was done, he exhaled long, steady. I thought leaving would feel like freedom, he said. But it mostly feels like losing something I didn't understand. That's because you didn't leave limitation, I said softly. You left the partnership. There were no raised voices, no accusations about wasted years. Just truth measured, controlled, undeniable. He walked me to the door. For a second, we stood facing each other, not as adversaries, not even as ex-lovers, just as two adults who had finally seen each other clearly. I hope your studio succeeds, I said. I hope you build something extraordinary, he replied. I already had. He just hadn't noticed. And with that, the confrontation ended not in flames, but in quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes the strongest dominance is composure, and I walked away with mine intact. It's been 2 years. People assume time heals dramatically, that it transforms you into someone unrecognizable. But healing, at least for me, didn't feel like transformation. It felt like integration. I still live in Seattle, though not in the same apartment. I chose a space with more light, fewer memories embedded in the walls, a place designed intentionally for one person, not in loneliness, but in alignment. At work, I stepped fully into leadership, not loudly, not performatively. Naturally, the systems I once built quietly are now frameworks others reference openly. I mentor younger women who are labeled too analytical or too cautious. I tell them something I wish someone had told me earlier. Caution is not fear, structure is not smallness, stability is not the absence of ambition. It is ambition with endurance. Emotionally, I am softer than I was before, but less negotiable. That may sound contradictory, but when you no longer need someone to validate your value, you become more generous, less reactive, more present. I date occasionally, slowly, intentionally. I no longer audition for roles in someone else's narrative. I don't shrink to fit vision. I don't inflate to compete with it. If someone describes me as grounded, I smile because now I understand the power in that word. Ground holds everything. I don't resent my ex-husband. In some ways, he gave me an unintentional gift. His misjudgment forced me to examine whether I had been undervaluing myself by tolerating misperception. He followed his passion, and I followed clarity. The difference is subtle but profound. He once believed I lacked vision because I didn't chase volatility. What he didn't understand was that my vision extended further. 10 years, 20, beyond emotion, beyond excitement. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-containment. It's about knowing your worth without announcing it. It's about understanding that you can love someone deeply and still refuse to diminish yourself for them. I am no longer someone's stabilizer. I am my own architect. And if I ever choose partnership again, it will be with someone who recognizes that the strongest foundations are rarely loud, but they are what everything else stands on. I didn't win anything. There was no trophy at the end of this. There was alignment, and alignment is enough. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. Being underestimated is not a weakness, but believing the underestimation is. For years, I allowed myself to be framed as the cautious one, the practical one, the emotional ceiling to someone else's ambition. Not because I lacked strength, but because I believed strength didn't require defense. And it doesn't, but dignity does require awareness. Love is not blind enthusiasm. Support is not silent self-erasure. Passion is not superior to preparation. The quiet partner in a relationship is not necessarily less ambitious. Sometimes, they're the only ones thinking long enough to protect the future. When my husband said our marriage was over because I didn't support his dreams, he thought he was choosing expansion. What he didn't realize was that I had already expanded quietly, structurally, independently. I didn't sabotage him. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't chase him. I prepared. And preparation changes the outcome of loss. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about self-respect. About understanding that if someone consistently misreads your stability as a limitation, the solution isn't to become louder, it's to become clearer. You can love someone and still walk away. You can be calm and still be powerful. You can be supportive without surrendering your own architecture. Sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make is the one no one sees coming because you've been building it for years. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been labeled too cautious, too quiet, or not passionate enough, when in reality, you were simply thinking long-term? I'd love to know your story, because sometimes the quiet ones are the ones holding everything together until they decide not to anymore.